we're on, ready to explore a little bit of governance and agreements and protocols and all that kind of stuff. I see that you're ready for it. Always ready.
Oh yes, governance. I love governance.
It's so interesting because it's one of these topics that is, I mean, it's such an obvious thing, right? Like you have a group of people, they want to do a thing, they have this vision and motivation and energy, but then it seems to me that many times when I come towards like different groups that are building things, like this governance part and the protocols and agreements is like this nightmare that we kind of need to battle around, and no one seems to really enjoy it. And I wonder what is your perspective, because like since I met you, I know like you seem like I love this shit, you know, like I think.
Yeah, so I suppose like maybe something I can say is like for me, this kind of like governance is kind of the sharp end of the stick, I think, for kind of org design, if you like. So it's kind of like where you're actually having to formalize things and you're having to manage those things that you formalize. And I think that to answer the question of why I love it so much, I mean, for me, it's programming on steroids. Like it involves people, it involves law, it involves economics, it involves risk, it's personalities, social capital. There's just so many things going on. It's like the ultimate chess, like for me. And so, like for me, I'm not. It taps into like. Have you ever heard of the concept of serious fun? Like where, like for me, it's like this is like I really enjoy it. And not in a kind of like I don't enjoy it like I'm playing a game, but I enjoy it in the sense of like I feel like it's a challenge that I get to collaborate on with other people. It's like the ultimate co-op game, without it being a co-op. We'll just push co-op to the side. I don't want to talk about co-ops. No, maybe we can. Yeah, so I think for me, that's kind of where I get a kick out of governance. I think a lot of people kind of, a bit like anything, it does become like different people have different ideas of what governance is or their version of governance. So I think it can dovetail into leadership very quickly, or like risk management, capacity management, capability building, compliance. Like there's a lot of things that it can be. And I think that inside Inspiral, especially within the MVB, it was this question of like trying to pare that down to what is actually the minimum here that we can get away with to hold a company. And that really came down to like financial risk, legal risk. There was like some very specific things, and then kind of saying that these other things that like if you were a private company would be risks that you would care about, are actually not a problem. Like, but how you also got around that was like Inspiral Foundation doesn't say, for example, have projects anymore. Like it doesn't have contracts. It doesn't. So there's no supply risk. You haven't got any kind of contractual risk really. You're not renting anything. You're not. It's just. Yeah. So you just constantly kind of keep on reducing your risk, and then you end up with something very small to manage. So I think when it comes to the nodes, it's really interesting because I think it's like, because there's Open Collective and Inspiral Foundation kind of already taking care of like a bunch of stuff, then the question is, what is the remaining governance that needs to be done for a node? And I think that's a very interesting question. And it does allow for you to kind of focus on, well, what is capacity planning? Or what is capacity building or capability building in a node? Like we just had this conversation on the connection call the other week, and it was talking about like, does the connection call have to stop? And I think the comment I made at the time was that like, well, it seems like it served its purpose. You all have relationships now that you've deepened over time, so you're not really connecting anymore. So the purpose of the call doesn't make sense. Now it's about like, now you have to try and actually do something together. And I think that governance at a node level is about trying to kind of lean into that as a group of saying, what are we actually trying to do here? Like, what is it we want to accomplish? How do we lead out on that? How do we organize around that? And I think that the governance is just about the formalizing of that. I think that as far as like Inspiral is concerned, there's this kind of very specific boring stuff around like Inspiral reps and some paperwork we need to do. I think that for me is like the pretty easy stuff. It's basically fill out some stuff, write some stuff. But I'd say like the more interesting question is like, if you're coming together as a node, what is going to keep you coming together? And it's a shared purpose, and that shared purpose needs to be articulated and explored and actually ideally realized. And I think that you coming together will be you ending up having governance conversations, in my opinion.
So fascinating what you shared. Like I really like first hearing the programming on steroids. I totally get you, and like it's fascinating, like this ultimate chess game where you have all this like legal things and managing risks, but also the social aspect of it, and like how do you actually keep people coming back and stepping into those leadership roles, and then making sure that this actually continues over time, and the power dynamics are all in check, and everyone is really happy with what is happening, and distributing the knowledge as well, and all of that. So it feels like so much to process and so much to have fun with. So I totally get you why you're enjoying it so much. And also, you mentioned the MVB, the minimum viable board in Enspiral. I remember when I was first reading through Enspiral handbook, when I came across Enspiral, like this idea fascinated me so much. Like it's wow, it's so cool. Like let's not create this massive over-designed thing, but like no, let's actually find what is the minimum that we have to do in order for this thing to work. I guess this is also maybe something I wanted to explore with you today, which is maybe a bit segueing into something slightly different, but like this balance between finding the complexity and actually defining it as certain protocols and rules, like this needs to be actually specific, versus keeping it fluid and like really simple. So instead of building for hours this imaginary set of rules, we can actually get things moving and then build the rules over the time. And I guess with Enspiral nodes, this is a very like a question that is very alive, because we are the first node now in Europe. We're just figuring out what does it mean to create our own governance, right? We have this umbrella of Enspiral that still provides quite a lot of, let's say, legal architecture as well, and the foundation. And we have certain agreements, and we have the node agreement that specifies clearly, like, hey guys, you need to do A, B, C, D, all of that kind of things. But still we have a possibility for experimentation. So I'm curious, like, how do you relate to this question of like balance between complexity and simplicity, and how much should you actually define on paper before you start doing a thing, whatever the thing is that your group wants to do?
Yeah, great question. So I think that one of the things we learned in governing Enspiral over the years was that this is, if you look at the handbook, this is why we have agreements and guides, where we realized that we needed to start pushing stuff out of our agreements and say like, no, that's actually guide documentation. And guides are generally, I don't know how like much we enforced this, but the idea was that generally guides are owned by a group. So for example, you might have ops own a guide on how to do onboarding, and they can basically just update it whenever they want without having to kind of take the whole organization through a change process. Whereas the agreements actually have to have an engagement process, and people come and agree on them. So the thing to say there is like, I think there's something there for me of like the if you think about it as like your agreements are essentially like a living constitution, and changing them is extremely costly. So when you put stuff in there, you really want to kind of avoid baking in things that are quite rigid. Like, for example, you wouldn't say that you have to report on this every quarter. Because if it's in the agreement, then you realize later that it should be every 6 months or every year, then it's like this kind of like frustrating kind of thing of like, oh, what is that a change that we need? Can we just make that change? Or is this something we're going to have to inform the community of? And so like trying to say like, from the agreement's perspective, it just says that a report must be done. And then it might say that it's up to a specific group, such as like the MVB, to decide on the cadence of that report. So it's kind of a combination of a requirement and a delegation. So when you're designing the agreements, I think that's kind of where we've ended up kind of leaning towards, of like agreements should be trying to aim to be quite adaptable, and there's some flexibility in them, but they should be very explicit on kind of delegations and requirements. But that they should be less specific on like numbers or timelines or things like that, unless it's like something to do with like a local law, you know, like if the local law in New Zealand says you have to do X every year, then you might have an agreement that kind of reflects that as well. So I think the other thing that we kind of got into at Enspiral was I think at one point we were doing this thing with agreements where they were very aspirational. So it's kind of like we came together as a group, we ran this big kind of process of engagement, bringing everyone together, and we were like, cool, this is the agreement that we've all agreed on how we're going to work in the future. And then it was kind of like that almost became like this what kind of weird non-living executive that then kind of was meant to kind of like be forced back upon us. And suddenly we were all meant to be compliant with the agreement. And the reality is it never worked. We were often finding ourselves like operationally at odds with what the agreement said. And then because we had baked these things that were very aspirational into the agreement, it became very, very expensive to undo them or change them. And so I think that, again, I think it's like one of the things, like when we come to like governance inside the node, I think the general rule of thumb is that an agreement should reflect what you kind of need now, as like it's a piece of infrastructure helping people organize, and it should be what you need like in a relatively short term. It shouldn't be kind of really truly imagining like some sort of crazy future state that you're going to move towards. It's not to say that you shouldn't do that, but what I think when inside of Enspiral, what we learned was that this was a very costly thing to do, and that what it ended up happening was that we ended up with this kind of inertia and this kind of slowing down and momentum of like updating the agreements and changing them, because it was just so expensive. Like bringing everyone in, and everyone would argue, and then we wouldn't actually follow through on it, and then it was just, and then there were all these people, like these amazing facilitators and thinkers that were giving giving free time, you know, the people on the MVB just giving free time to try and push this thing along, and then these things wouldn't happen. And I think it was just, and then what happened was we basically, the person would burn out and they'd leave. So we had created a machine which took the kind of the people that were like really there in the center, really trying hard, and kind of just burning through them, and they would have to leave because they didn't know what else to do. They had to get out. And I think that was like the weirdest kind of thing to end up in, is like the mechanism of the organization was basically it was like this weird exit of the most kind of, not senior, I don't want to say, but like the most invested person at that point in time. And that was a really strange kind of moment to be in. And I think that when we moved to working groups and we started moving to, you know, the working group agreement was really probably the first thing that really went and said, here is a container to kind of do some experimentation without us having to write agreements for it. And the catalyst as well. It was trying to say, like, here are some new kinds of infrastructure and delegations that are labeled things to happen without us having to update the handbook and run these kind of big change management practice things, and just say, like, actually, we have enough trust and we have enough maturity in our collective to have someone go and do an experiment. And so I think, like, in the last few years, we've ended up with much more of an experimental culture. But I think also that experimentation kind of pushed into ventures as well, where the ventures became containers for more kind of business experimentation, and that stopped happening inside of the network. And I think people kind of, you know, back in the day when Enspiral was a co-op, people oh no,
We're back.
we're back. Hey, that's okay. Yeah, so I think and I think these patterns, we could easily go through the same things in the node. That's the interesting point, is that inside of the node we could repeat this mistake around writing agreements that are aspirational rather than focusing on what we need. We could not be experimental, and we could try and, and so I think there's like, but I doubt we will. Like, I mean, we've got enough people that kind of have been through this that I mean, certainly I'm going to be putting my hand up and saying, hey, let's not do that.
No. You're aspirational now. Stop it.
Yeah. Don't be aspirational. How dare you? I want cynics, the node of cynics. No. But no, I think that's the thing. It's like non-aspirational agreements, but aspirational experiments.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, so I think for us in the nodes, and I think that, so when you're doing governance, as a group, for us, I think the important thing is to kind of go and say, I remember, like, Billy once said that he made the analogy to like the playground, where the people that were in governance were responsible for kind of making sure there was a fence around the playground, making sure that the kind of various kind of climbing gyms were relatively safe, like there was no like horrific kind of pit of spikes that someone's going to die in, but like, people can fall over and they can break their arm and they can hurt themselves, but no one's going to like really like hurt themselves. And that was kind of creating that environment for playful experimentation and exploration, and not trying to like coddle people or protect people from mistakes. That's fine, but we want to learn, and we just want to make sure that it's a safe-ish space.
I really like this frame to think about governance as this governance playground, and just make sure that, okay, there is a fence around it, no like pit where you can just die, but mistakes are fine, and the rest is really empowering people to experiment, to make mistakes, to actually build things, because this is where the energy, like the social energy, is, right? Like when we are making things together, when we are having a great time together, the energy, even if we give energy, we get a lot of it back, because we see like, oh wow, this is working, we're having a great time, or we're having a difficult time, but there's a progress that we're making. And while on the other side, when you have just like this too many fences and like so much like rigid and aspirational agreements that are not really reflecting our current reality, it can really create this feeling of stuckness, and like you want to get stuff done but you just can't. And I feel also it's very important to kind of underline this concept that you were saying about like how expensive it is to change an agreement when everyone needs to be involved. And okay, if it's a team of 3, it's easy, but if it's a network of 100 people, it becomes just almost impossible.
Even for our node, I mean, how many people are in the node? Like 10, 15?
Yeah, we're now maybe less than 20, yeah.
Okay, so like, I mean, how easy do you think it will be to get an agreement through?
Yeah, I guess depends what is the agreement policy, right? Like,
it does. I mean, you might get like, hey, we're gonna duplicate Inspiral's diversity agreement or something like that, and it's like, and it's like, sure, that's easy. But like, if you want to do something more complicated, something to do with money, for example.
And this is, I have a good example for that, because we had this when Inspiral Europe node was created, with this kind of formal decision from the board. Yes, guys, you can be a node. Amazing. The next thing we did, we ran a Lumio poll to ask, okay, now we exist, who wants in? Give us a thumbs up. And we had a list of, I think, 20 people. But then the next step was, okay, now we're going to set up infrastructure. Part of the infrastructure is we're not going to be paying our membership anymore to New Zealand. We're going to be paying it to Open Collective, where we run our own finances in Inspiral Europe. But maybe only 10 people or 11 actually signed up for the memberships. And I think there's like 2 or 3 people that intentionally didn't do it to do like a yearly thing in January. But there was quite a percentage.
I think I just signed up twice, actually. I think I just was like, okay,
you're a double member. More voting power.
Yes. How to hack Inspiral. Belong to many nodes with many votes.
but yeah, and I've seen that, you know, there was quite a percentage of people that just like didn't take this next step, and I wonder like if it's not, you know, like they clearly express the interest. So I guess it's just like this extra hassle that you need to go through. So it costs energy, right? You need to set up an account, create a thing. You need to, oh, maybe you don't know how it works.
I think the thing there is like, yeah, I mean, I hear your point. It's still a change management cost, but it's still not an agreement. You know, I think that the difference is like, it's going to be, if we were talking about like, cool, we've got like $500, what are we doing with our money? So even like going and saying we're going to do co-budget, or going to say we're going to use it to subsidize tickets to the event, or like, even if that's not an agreement, you still have to kind of then, yeah, because like you still end up with having to have an agreement with how you make the decision. You know, like, is it full consensus? Is everyone involved? You know, like, how do you, like, this is collective funds, how do you manage it as a group? Therefore you need an agreement on that. And so I think that for me is like where the rubber really hits the road on kind of writing the policy and the procedures of the group, you know, like if we wanted to use boring business terms for it. And I think, again, like, I think it's, that stuff is, a lot of it's about almost like, it's not really about financial risk or brand risk. It's almost relational risk at that point in time when it comes to like the administration of collective assets of any kind. It's like, if you get it wrong, the cost is going to be in the relationships. So I think that that's another part of governance, is like, how do we, especially for us as a small group, as a node, how do we prioritize our relationships and how we organize? And, you know, like, we trust each other, and being quick to forgive, and, you know, having open conversations about this stuff. Like, I mean, there's loads of ways of doing it, but I think sometimes, like, something that I learned a long time ago was that you can do a high trust hand wave anytime you like, but every time you do one, you're risking trust, and you're risking you're risking relationships. Because if you say, you know what, I know how to do this thing, I know how to do this, how to organize the party at the retreat, and I just need $200, just trust me. And then we rock up at the party, and I show up with a keg, and you're like, I didn't really want a frat party, Dan. Like, come on. Like, why did you like show up with a keg? And it was bad beer. You know, that's not a party. I was expecting like lights and, you know, interesting music, and you showed up with a keg and a crappy Bluetooth speaker. And so like, and it's kind of like, well, what happened there? Like, what is the cost of that? The cost is, next year I propose the same thing. And you may have given me feedback on it, but then maybe next time I propose something else, but again, I disappoint you. And I've just kind of been doing this high trust hand wave to kind of get around having good kind of processes for how we kind of sign off on spending collective assets, you know, or borrowing something. It could be as well. Like, let's say we had in the future, we had Inspiral Europe had a batch, like we had a building somewhere, and we had a little retreat building on someone's property that anyone could go and stay at, but I go and use it, and after every time I use it, I leave it messy. And it's like, you can give me feedback, but it's like, and then I say, okay, and I'll do better, trust me, and then I don't. Like, what's the cost of that? It's like, and it comes into the trust and the relationships. And inside Inspiral, they used to talk about like the collective energy FBOSS card, where anyone can kind of pick up the card and spend the collective energy and attention. And there's a finite amount of it, and everyone has the power to waste it all. And I think that's a little bit like with the trust and the relationships and stuff as well, of like, anyone can like break the trust that we have. And it's not an infinite amount. There's a finite amount of trust there. And I will say this, the ironic thing with trust is, the flip side of it is, if I say, hey bro, trust me, I'll run the party, and then it's a fucking amazing party, then you're going to be like, holy shit, I'm going to trust Dan more. So the ironic thing is that if I use trust to get ahead, and I shortcut using trust, and I shortcut good process and due diligence and shortcut governance, basically. The ironic thing is if it's successful, we actually all end up better off. But the question is it if we're trying to cultivate a group for the long term, I think the difference is that it's a bit like your investment for your retirement. Like if you go in the growth fund, you might get an extra 2%, but when the market goes bad, you'll lose 30. Like it's like okay, yeah, we get a little bit more trust, but when you fuck it up, it's like, oh shit, you just spent a lot of it. And I think that for me is like, I think good governance for me is like that you should avoid having to use trust to kind of grease to get through things, or when you do use trust, you use them on low risk things. So you go and say, yeah, $200. Actually, I don't care about $200. I really, really don't. So therefore, I trust you. And if it didn't work out, I actually haven't lost any trust and you wrote the report, which was all I really wanted. And we have an experimental culture and there's going to be mistakes and that's fine. And so I think like the governance is about like trying to create a place where that is how things are. So it also comes down to I think stewarding culture is an interesting one, because I think at some point, if governance ends up being all of these things, then a governing group ends up having to do all of these things. And I think this is coming back to the MVB. I think it is actually quite important to be very clear on what is the stuff you need to govern and what is the stuff you can leave and just trust people to kind of self-organize and do. And I think that the MVB saying it was not going to do this thing created the space for the node to come into existence and the working groups to come into existence and say, we're going to do these things. And I think when we do the node stuff, if we go and say, as a group, what is it that we want to govern? What's important to us? But also what isn't? What is going too far? What is a bit micromanagey? What can we just leave to the group to self-organize and practice self-management and high trust?
Yeah, that's also a fascinating balance that you're mentioning. And I like this kind of fractalness that is happening. We had Enspiral, and then there was just like Enspiral, and then working groups. And then the kind of Enspiral Europe really was a working group, or then two working groups, and then a node appears, but then the node needs its own working groups within the node. But then, of course, we don't want to micromanage everything. So there's still like a part of culture and self-management that just needs to be left there.
Yeah, I think that this will come into existence, like where nodes will probably... It'll be interesting to see like how big nodes get and whether it becomes like, whether there's, because there's no hard caps on it. In the agreements, there's no rules around that, around like how big, could a node end up being 200 people and have more members in it than the network? Like, what does that mean? It feels a bit odd. We'll probably end up having a conversation about it if it happens, but we don't need to worry about it now. But it is fractal. I see what you're saying. I think that, like we've got I think that this is an interesting point. I think my view on this is that where possible, we shouldn't say like a working group is inside of a node. We should say like the connection working group, from my perspective. I know it's a Europe-centric thing, but I would love it if it was kind of a separate thing of the node that it existed inside Enspiral. And it just happens to be the Enspiral Europe connection thing. But to go and say that it is inside of the node means that the people that are not inside of the node in Europe kind of don't get to participate. And that might be true for like if someone went and had like something for like DAO stuff, or like one of the other nodes that are spinning up. A similar story of like, once you go and say that this is inside of this, it becomes exclusive. And I think where possible, we should try to avoid that as a pattern. So even though I totally get what you're saying, like we will likely end up with some sort of subcommittee inside of the node, and you can call it a working group if you want, but I think we really need to ask the question of like, could we put this outside of the node, or is it very specific to the node's function?
I like this idea, and I think this is also one of the big topics to explore. as more nodes start popping up with time, there's going to be this whole set of relational dynamics between different nodes and between Inspiral members in different nodes, and what does it mean, and what is the access from node to node. And for now we see like, hey, if you're a part of a node, you are a part of Inspiral, so theoretically you kind of have access to all the nodes. But how it's gonna actually unfold in practice, we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think I think a big part of it is just scale. You know, Inspiral's not that big at the moment. It was bigger before, but and I think like there's a never-ending inquiry of like, are we trying to grow the network? Are we trying to bring people in? Like, or because I think it's funny for me. It feels very much like, almost like like being Jewish for me. Like I remember my mum telling me that like she converted, and she said she had this conversation with the rabbi very early on, where the rabbi said like, why do you want to convert? You're joining the most persecuted people in history, like his words. And she was like, oh well, I'm in love with South Africa. I'm in love with my father Mark, and he's Jewish, and I have to get Jewish to be married. And the rabbi was like, that's not good enough. And he like really lent into pushing on her. And it turns out this is a thing where they almost try to convince you not to convert. And I feel like that's kind of a little bit like Inspiral. It's like we're not proactively trying to. I mean, we kind of pull people in, but we're not really trying. And it's kind of like if you find us, it's like it's meant to be. But we're not really trying, and that's not how it always was. I mean, I remember talking to JV, and he said like when he started, he was hardcore on recruitment. He was recruiting people. It was like, I got to build the thing. So I think that's another interesting question with nodes, because that's kind of happened in Inspiral at large. And I think that relates to its kind of the inertia kicking in and things slowing down. And as it moves to being this kind of network of nodes and working groups and things, I think it's just become like, well, what is it that people are joining? Like, the offer's very unclear. The invitation is very unclear. But now with nodes, the invitation could get very clear again. And I wonder if that means that as nodes spin up and they have the power to invite people, which is actually the specific difference between a working group and a node at the moment, is that I wonder if that's going to kind of possibly see a resurgence of people coming into the network. And then you will run into this, what you're getting at, which is what happens when there's 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 people in the network worldwide. And what happens with nodes then when you have 100 of them? It's like, okay, yeah, I think we're going to definitely get into some conversations about liquid democracy, and we're definitely going to have to, like, our agreements are going to have to, we're going to have to really sharpen them things. And, what about the MVB? And like, do nodes have delegates going to the MVB? Like, how does that work? Or, like, what is the relationship? Money, like at the moment we're saying that nodes don't have to give money to foundation, but if everyone moves into nodes, then that's not financially viable for the foundation. And then also like ventures, like in the future, can a venture just contribute to its local node? Like I think there's a lot of interesting questions, but a lot of it's predicated on scale, I think, for me. And if the network's going to stay the same size, I think that honestly we'll see like a few little nodes pop up, and it mainly allows for geographic differences, and things will just tick over, and the MVB will kick on like the way it is already, and like we probably won't see too much change. It's really if we start seeing nodes pulling a lot more people in, and we see that kind of pick up in the total numbers, that I think we'll have some structural conversations that we need to talk about.
That makes a lot of sense. So I have maybe one more question for you to kind of bring it to the present, because I really like this idea of making agreements for what is relevant right now rather than, aspirational. So yeah, like we know there's this unclear future, how nodes will evolve and how Inspiral Europe will evolve. We're really experimenting, so let's see. But I'm curious from your perspective, like in the moment where we are now, where, okay, we have a formally established node in Inspiral, the first one. We have, let's say, around 20 people. We had our few physical gatherings. there seems to be finally, after our last summer gathering, to be some energy in the governance, which wasn't really there before. We just were kind of being together and doing the connection work, right? Like it served its purpose, because it seems like, okay, now people want to start building the node, so we have some energy. What do you, and we have the open collective set up, right? Like this is one of our, let's say, key infrastructure elements. We have our separate payment system, separate budget, people contribute monthly to an open collective. We haven't even figured out yet how we're going to be spending this money, how we're going to make decisions around it, but okay, there is a shared pot. So in this place where we are now, what do you feel are kind of the most relevant agreements that we are, due to make? Or what are the things that are really like, okay, it's time to think about those things right now in this stage where the very basic foundation has been down and it seems solid. We have relationships, we have trust, we have a little group of people that is already contributing energy for some time. What's next for us, but like the near future next?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say there's probably two ways of looking at it. So I'm not going to like name specific agreements, but I'm just going to name like how I would get to answering the question. So I think like the first way would be to go and say, what do people need or what do we need to kind of build that fence and that kind of relative safety for the playground? So like we don't have a diversity and inclusion agreement at the moment. We don't have a conflict resolution agreement. We don't have, we could say, I mean, it could be very easy. We just go and agree to adopt NSPIRALs, sure. But we actually haven't done that. So I think for me, it's like, I'd be interested in this question around, are there any kind of like, what is your, not deepest fear would be the same thing, but like, what would be like, if you stretched yourself really hard, what could possibly worry you? Like if you imagine something not going well right now in the group, what could that be that would really make you feel uncomfortable, and what could we have in place that would make you feel more comfortable? So I think like trying to kind of almost like debug the edge cases of the group. We're kind of constantly in this happy path at the moment, and so like we kind of, to start building agreements, we have to start imagining a little bit of what could go wrong, and trying to kind of and that is governance, is trying to go and say, what are the risks? How do we protect ourselves? How do we, the finances, I mean, again, finances is actually really easy, but when you talk about like trust and reputation, relationships and yeah, and I think that, it's, I think that how we invite people, like I think there's some very mechanical agreements that are quite easy to tick off, and then I think there's more these kind of borderline cultural underpinning policies and foundational agreements that I think are worth exploring. I think the other thing would be more to go and say, I think we need like a back pressure or a compass point to orientate off of. So what I would suggest is like, we need like a collective project that we've all agreed to push for. And then we ask the question of like, well, what agreements are needed to do that? And that might be like, the project is aspirational, it's an experiment or something. Like, so for example, summer retreat, I don't think we need any agreements for it. I think like that's the funny thing, is like there's people that know how to run these things and it just kind of ticks over and it kind of just happens. But like it might be worth asking the question of like, do we need an agreement that says, are we running the retreat through the open collective? Yeah, we are. It's not going through like the hump. Okay. So that's different now. Like previously they used to run through adventures. So yeah, so then like no one's wearing financial risk for running the retreat. I don't see why you need an agreement then at the retreat, like other than again like safety rail stuff. But if you went and said, we want to run a convention or a public event to kind of introduce NSPIRAL to other people in Europe, okay, so then do we need agreements to support that? And what would they be? and that would then be like a way of creating a back pressure for us to kind of orientate off of. It could, I don't know, do we want to build, I don't want to build software.
No.
Do we want to publish something? Do we need
Yeah.
agreements around publishing? Do
Yeah.
we, like it's yeah, so I think that, like I said before, I think that there's actually, because Inspiral has got a whole bunch of these agreements in place already for us, it might just be as simple as saying like, yeah, we follow that one for some of these things. And because we've already got like fintech from Open Collective, I think it's also easier on the financial management side of things. So I think it really comes down to, it's probably the stuff we need to lean into is more the agreements to cover ourselves off for kind of protecting relationships and trust, and making inclusive spaces and dealing with conflict and things like that. That's probably the most important. And some of that Inspiral already has, but it will be worth reviewing. And that might be where we review that and we publish that stuff. That might be then, and there might be a slight difference between how we do it in a node versus the network level. And so, it might be that we have a more onerous conflict resolution policy, like whereas the network can't really afford to do that. So, or it's done ad hoc. So I think like that's something where we could potentially be leading out on designing that, and it might be useful for other nodes.
That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, like it is the case, right? That there was this whole idea of the building code, right? That the Inspiral provides like a guideline that we need to comply with certain things. And it sometimes can be as easy as say, hey, we're in our node, we're going to do it the same way as Inspiral already does it, right? So it's kind of copy pasting. But I see your point that even if you copy paste it just to start the process, it's useful to review it because our context is ultimately it's different, right? So some things might be different. So it's worth to take some time to review that. And of course, the kind of capital of relationships and trust is probably, or for sure, I guess, the most valuable thing that we have. Really, it's not the couple €100 we have in the bank account. So this is really the most worth protecting asset that we have.
Yeah, I actually, I'd have to go and check, but I've got this funny feeling that the way it worked with the agreements was I think the node agreement says something like we adopt all of Inspiral's agreements, but we can override them, or like if we write our own. But the thing is that I will name this, that we haven't gone through an inclusive onboarding process where everyone has read all of them. It's like we've kind of got this kind of like organizational infrastructure that most people have never even don't even know exists, let alone read. And I think that that's probably one of, like, it might be that us as a node, actually, even if we're just adopting the one from Inspiral, we need to actually have an agreement of adopting, meaning everyone has reviewed it. Like that maybe that's important. I don't know. Like when people get invited to Inspiral, how many people go and read the agreements? I don't know. I think for me, it's like organizational wonks go and read them.
Yeah.
And otherwise, there's just like a core group of people that know, like, have actually, read them, edited them, know them backwards, and know that they're there and know when we need to apply them. So I don't know if it's a case of that everyone needs to be. Yeah, I think that I feel like for us as a node to bring people together around governance would be good to that everyone has either maybe it's not that they have reviewed these materials, but maybe it's like a series of video calls like this where where two of us go through each of the, like, a couple of agreements, like, and talk and discuss it, and then they can just watch the video. And so, like, almost like onboarding people into the handbook via video, or podcast, like, because I think that the problem is that at the moment I think they're quite inaccessible. They're transparent but not accessible.
This is awesome. Just gonna make a card for it.
Nice.
As always, I've been contributing to a lot of cards.
I feel rich.
Yeah. Poof, poof, poof. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was super amazing, Dan. I feel like we covered lots of this kind of nitty-gritty, but also more abstract and general things. And I'm really coming out of this idea of the governance as a playground and seeing these little different components and just organizing this fence to protect, you know, the entity and people inside, but then really design it to encourage experimentation and deliberately design it so it doesn't get stuck, and just bring this energy and make things happen. And
Yeah.
sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes, you know, people will risk their trust, but at the end of the day, that's what brings us together. No, we want to do something together, so we have already a great foundation for it.
Yeah, I think yeah, I didn't say this earlier, but I will quickly say it. I think a good agreement should feel like Lego, where it can be built upon. You know, I feel like when I remember writing that working group agreement and a feeling like not a very proud person, but actually felt quite proud of it when I finished kind of drafting it with JV and Ants. I think it was the three of us. I can't remember, but like I felt like this was well done, and it kind of was maybe not timeless, and it probably will need, of course everything needs to be updated at some point, but it felt like people could use it in unexpected ways, and that I think I liked about it. That you weren't quite sure how it was going to be used. I think that the node agreement, I think, is following along that kind of tradition now of like, we actually don't know what's going to be a node and how it's going to be used. You know, we don't, maybe someone does like do a massive sign up spring and there's 150 people in some random node.
The random
technically
node.
Okay. Yeah, rando node. The random node.
Join us.
So yeah, I think that for me is what makes up a good agreement. Sorry, I know we were checking out, but I just wanted to get that little snippet in there. This has been lovely for me, as I love talking about this stuff. It's not very often I think it's good questions. It's been quite expansive. Actually, it's been good prompts to kind of reflect on history, but also current situation. Yeah, this has been lovely. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for
I also
inviting
had a great fun and lots of learning. And I hope it's going to be useful for all the node starting crowd.